Hello there, YouTube. Well, it is no secret that I love 2D platformers, and I thought I would finally come here and tell you what my favourite 2D platformers are, because it's something that's been asked of me a few times, and it's something I keep saying that I'm going to make, but I never seem to get round to. Now, I was trying to think how I would describe these platformers, how I'd describe some of my all-time favourite games, and I quickly realised other people have probably described it before me. So instead of me blathering on and trying to find the words, I decided I would find clips of others who have already done the same thing. So in this top 10, I've gone a slightly different route. I've got cut down clips of some of my favourite YouTubers who over time have covered some of my favourite games, and I'm going to give you a snippet of their taste. I will be discussing these games myself in future videos and going into some real depth with each game getting its own video. But until then, this is my top 10 games, and on top of that, a selection of YouTubers who I recommend you look at. The first game we're going to discuss is Axiom Verge, and to discuss it is Nitrorad.
Axiom Verge is a Metroid-inspired indie game developed by Thomas Happ, and no one else. Yeah, it was developed by a single person. It released back in March on PS4 and in May on Steam. Now, firstly, I don't really want to call this a Metroidvania game because it borrows a lot from classic Metroid, but it's really nothing like the explorative Castlevania games like Symphony of the Night. Well, I mean, other than it being a game about exploration with a large open map. You play as Trace, a scientist who stumbles across an alien world after a lab explosion. After meeting with a bizarre alien race who appears in the shape of a disembodied mechanical face, he agrees to help them in their endeavors to prevent an enemy called Athetos from destroying their homeworld. That's the story at face value. It does go a lot deeper and honestly a little bit confusing, though I myself found it pretty interesting. On your journey, you'll explore the planet, collecting new weapons, power-ups, and blasting aliens along the way. The game is very similar to Metroid on NES. I wouldn't really compare it to Super Metroid like I've seen others do. A lot of criticism I've seen about this game is that it doesn't quite accomplish the same feats that Super Metroid did, and I don't really see that to be fair in the least. Axiom Verge is inspired by Metroid on NES, and it further expands on the elements introduced in that game. If you ask me, it makes your game a lot more original if you build off the basic formula instead of one a little more fleshed out already. The game also reminds me a little bit of Cave Story in regards to both the control scheme and the amount of inventive weapons you're able to collect and use. There's a lot of weapons in this game, and it's actually likely that you only encounter half of them on your first playthrough. That is, unless you're very explorative. Finding new weapons is very exciting, and it won't be long before you find a couple that you really enjoy using. They're all very diverse. No two weapons feel alike, and it creates a lot of opportunities for various playstyles. The Axiom Disruptor serves as your main weapon. As you progress through the game, you'll unlock new functions for it, such as a drill that can break through blocks, and a grappling hook that allows you to swing across gaps. Each new ability increases your maneuverability, eventually to a degree so great that you're able to explore the entire world very thoroughly. It's just one of those games where you feel like a total badass by the end of the game. Possibly the coolest function of the Axiom Disruptor is the distortion field. With this, you can fire a beam that'll corrupt enemy sprites, making them function in handicapped ways. You can also use it to restore corrupted game assets, clearing a path, or to corrupt tiles in the background, creating platforms. This is a pretty unique idea that, until now, I haven't really seen done really well. Axiom Verge's art style is a bit of an oddity to me. The whole robotic, dismembered face thing has always made me feel on edge, but Axiom Verge's stylistic 8-bit approach created character design that I found creepy yet somehow enthralling. The environments often sport a gross and organic vibe, being on an alien planet where beating hearts and organs substitute as fauna. Again, it's got a very Metroid vibe to it, though Axiom Verge does manage to create a vibe of its own. Sound effects are harsh and malformed, and despite being 8-bit, the larger boss creatures wear breathing and pulsating hides of flesh as they spur relentless amounts of bullets your way. The boss fights are a pretty good time, figuring out their attack patterns and locating their weak points. It's absolutely classic. However, one or two of the later boss fights do suffer from a frustrating difficulty spike. The world map is really helpful. Unlike the Metroid games, there was never a time where I felt totally lost without any idea as to what to do next. Part of what really helps this is the ability to place reminders on the map. This way, if you encounter an area that you suspect a later obtained ability or tool will allow access, you can then mark it on the map so you can find it again later. That's not to say that the map is too helpful. It only represents each room with a square and nothing more. It keeps track of where you've been and where you can go, but outside of that, it doesn't ever hold your hand in regards to exploring the game world. It's a great balance that hits the mark just right. The game is about 10 hours long, longer if you go back and find all of the weapons, collectibles, and lore. All in all though, Axiom Verge is a fantastic game that Metroid and Metroidvania fans are likely to love. Even if you're like me and you're not really that into Metroidvania, you might still get a solid amount of enjoyment out of it. I highly recommend Axiom Verge.
So that was Axiom Verge, a fantastic exploration platformer, and I believe a genuine evolution on Super Metroid. Next I want to discuss a game that often gets ignored and pushed back. It's often hated, in fact, by a lot of people, and I think it's done just because that's the way the internet has decided to treat this game, and that is New Super Mario Bros. U. And to discuss that, I have CGR Undertow.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. In 1985, Nintendo launched a console with a game in which players ran from side to side, jumped on turtles, and saved a princess. Almost 3 decades later, they're doing the same thing. Only this console comes with a touchscreen, and this game is f***ing unbelievable. Hey, I said things stay the same, too. It's New Super Mario Bros. U. And of course, it's only fair and a little surprising to point out that this is the first Mario game Nintendo has launched with a home console since 1996, and the first of the side-scrolling variety since the Super Nintendo in 1991. That game was called Super Mario World. It's only fitting that this game would share some history with it. I mean, why not? Shares everything else. Continuous overworld? Check. Baby Yoshi? Check. Suit that lets you float? Check. Mario U is so reminiscent of Mario World, and even Mario Bros. 3 to an extent, that if you grew up playing those games, you'll immediately fall for this one. Now, that's not to say this is just a cover band playing all the greatest hits. I mean, it's obvious the people designing today's Mario games adored the classic titles, as their nods to the old school are abundant, but their work on Mario U suggests they're finally interested in progressing 2D Mario design as well. For starters, this has some of the best Mario levels in years, maybe decades, and that's not hyperbole. They get better and better as you get closer to Peach's castle, but even the early stages benefit from really clever approaches to 2D platformer design. The foundation's clearly a combination of Mario's 2 best side-scrollers, but from there, New Super Mario Bros. U gets genuinely creative, not to mention brutal. And while it doesn't do much with the gamepad aside from letting you play on the touchscreen, Mario U does quite a bit with the platform's built-in software. No other launch title shows as much potential for the Miiverse, allowing players to share their reactions to levels with drawings or messages, and the game even has modes for things like speedruns, which is awesome for veterans. Once again, jump into the Mushroom Kingdom. If you're a regular visitor, plenty of new features and razor-sharp platforming awaits you. And if it's been a while, you might be surprised by what they've done with the place. A masterful combination of old and new, New Super Mario Bros. U is the Mushroom Kingdom you've always remembered, only better.
That was CGR Undertow covering New Super Mario Bros. U, which, again, I believe is so underhated. It, plus its fantastic DLC, New Super Luigi U, is one of the best Mario games that exists. But for some reason, it's treated as if it's not worthy of being considered one of the best. for no reason other than the fact that it's derivative of the previous Mario games in the series, as if that somehow makes it bad. As if being the same as something else that was also brilliant is not as good as being brilliant on your own. Yes, it's the same as all the ones that came before it, but so is Sunsets and Rainbows, you Philistine. So yeah, that's New Super Mario Bros. Next on the list, we're going to go for an action game. Now we're going to go for a more action-packed action platformer with Cyber Shadow, and to cover that we have Good Vibes Gaming.
When I first got my hands on a demo of Cyber Shadow at PAX East 2019, I was instantly smitten by how polished its old-school Ninja Gaiden-inspired gameplay felt, to say nothing of its smooth 8-bit aesthetics punctuating what seemed to be a futuristic, dystopian world inspired by gritty, moody settings like those seen in other NES classics like Batman, Shatterhand, and Journey to Silius. Considering how deeply impressed I was by that two-stage demo, imagine my surprise when I learned that Cyber Shadow had already been in development for years by a single person. Though you wouldn't know it from the name alone, Finnish indie developer Mechanical Head Studios is a literal one-man operation whose sole member is Arne Mechaskull Hunziker, director and designer of Cyber Shadow. It wasn't until several years into Cyber Shadow's development that the celebrated studio behind Shovel Knight, Yacht Club Games, approached Hunziker with a publishing offer to help bring the game to the finish line, thinking Cyber Shadow to be a strong fit for Yacht Club's brand identity and established pedigree. Now, after playing Cyber Shadow in its entirety for myself, all I can say is this. Yacht Club doesn't just know how to make them, they know how to pick them too. Retro-styled, nostalgia-soaked 2D action platformers are a dime a dozen these days, sure, but they're not all created equal, and Cyber Shadow manages to stand out from the crowd in much the same way Shovel Knight did. The focus here is rightly on the pixel-perfect run, jump, and slash gameplay, and it is here that Cyber Shadow excels. Taking control of the cybernetic ninja Shadow, players initially have a very narrow range of actions they can take, starting off with little more than a jump and a basic sword slash. This may sound limiting, but this breaking in period is brief and serves an important purpose, allowing players to acclimate to the controls and physics before being thrown into the deep end of what can be a pretty tough game at times. Fortunately, Cyber Shadow is remarkably deliberate and well-paced in terms of the rate at which new moves and abilities are unlocked, and it feels like each one is introduced at just the right time. This keeps the game feeling fresh and exciting throughout, as it layers in new gameplay elements frequently but not too frequently as to be overwhelming. This deliberate pacing also emphasizes just how well designed Shadow's different abilities are and how well they complement one another. As Shadow's repertoire expands, it quickly becomes clear just how comfortably each new move fits in with the rest as you devise new ways to combine and string together different actions. And suffice to say, it's incredibly satisfying to figure this stuff out in the moment and feel your skill improving as you play. This satisfyingly measurable sense of skill-based progress also manifests in the game's numerous boss fights, which are generally fantastic and represent another jewel in Cyber Shadow's platforming crown. Some of the bosses can feel aggressively tough at first, but that's by design. You're not meant to brute force your way through them, and the fact that you generally can't is a feature, not a flaw. No matter how chaotic they may seem, each boss has movement and attack patterns that can be broken down and learned through old-fashioned observation and practice. Easily dispatching a boss that felt oppressively difficult not too long ago because you learned how to appropriately predict and react to its attacks provides a special rush that only the most well-designed bosses provide, and Cyber Shadow is full of them. The smart, inspired level design and mostly excellent controls mean that any deaths you incur are usually your fault too, which helps prevent the game from feeling cheap and engenders a just one more time approach as you try again and, well, get good. Now, it's a known fact that any great platformer, retro or otherwise, needs an awesome soundtrack to match, and Cyber Shadow absolutely knocks it out of the park on this front. Composed by the newcomer-veteran duo of Enrique Martin and Jake Vert Kaufman, Cyber Shadow's soundtrack is absolutely packed with powerful, hard-driving Mega Man-style platforming anthems that are as catchy and earwormy as they are contemplative and dramatic. Suffice to say, fans of chip music and 8-bit video game soundtracks in general are in for a real treat here, and I say that as someone who falls squarely into both camps. But Cyber Shadow's music is more than just great on its own. It also goes a long way toward enhancing the game's moody aesthetics and really pulled me into the game's gritty dystopian world, especially when playing with headphones. Straight up, this is one of the first truly great soundtracks of 2021. Cyber Shadow also benefits from strong visual design across the board, with sharp, easily readable sprite designs for Shadow and his enemies, detailed backgrounds that help convey the world's scale from stage to stage, and smooth, polished pixel animation. Now, if retro 8-bit inspired graphics don't appeal to you for whatever reason, nothing here is likely to change your mind, but for those of us who can't get enough of this aesthetic, Cyber Shadow is a pleasure to behold throughout.
So that was Cyber Shadow, one of the most adrenaline-packed action platformers that I've played in a good long while. One I highly recommend, and again, like Axiom Verge before it, created by only one guy. An amazing feat when you consider that. It's actually something that's going to come up a lot in these games, is how few people made them. Anyway, on to the next one. The next one is a return to mascot platforming, and a return to some of the styles that I really like from the old 16-bit days, particularly that of games like the Donkey Kong Country series, and that is Kaze and the Wild Masks. And to cover that, we have I Dream of Indie.
Everyone, gather around. It's the ex-hardcore gamer with a story to tell you. Years ago, old gamer Joe and I were hanging around, and he said, "Hey X, do you think that sometime we'll be able to see platformers and mascot games again?" And I said, "No way, it's not gonna happen." I have never been more happy to be wrong, and here we are with the latest example after years of platformers and mascot games back again with Kaze and the Wild Masks. I don't personally think that story is important in a game like Kaze and the Wild Masks, but it's there for those that do care. Play as Kaze and save your friend Hogo from a curse that spread chaos around the islands. Face enraged living vegetables by invoking the powers of the Wild Masks. That's right, vegetables. Some fun was had with Kaze by being able to take the iconic "Winners Don't Use Drugs" opening graphic and replaced it with "Winners Eat All Their Veggies." With story taking a backseat, it really is all about the gameplay in Kaze and the Wild Masks. The gameplay is simple, it's straightforward, it's a nice 2-button control system, you have jump and you have attack. The attack is a spin move that also allows you to hover in the air. This simplicity allows you to pick up and play a well-refined platformer inspired by the 16-bit platformers of the early 90s. There's a wide variety of levels that you can play that all provide unique environments and mechanics. This allows for ice, wind, swinging vines, and even little gears that act just like the barrels of Donkey Kong Country. Kaze will even take further inspiration from these platformers of yesteryear by allowing you to collect gems, find hidden levels, and collect letters to spell out the name Kaze. One thing I really appreciate about all these bonus items and things to collect in the game is that it was more than just to be able to say that you got 100% or just to unlock an achievement. It actually would give you more levels to play that had even further challenges for you to complete. The final major mechanic of this game is right in the title, a wild mask. Throughout various levels, you'll find different masks to give different abilities to help you get to areas or do things you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. This is very similar to the classic Genesis game Kid Chameleon. Unlike Kid Chameleon though, it's only going to be certain levels and you're going to only have one for that level. There's no switching back and forth while you play. This would probably be the one downfall I would say of this game, that the mask element is not used as well as it could have been. All these aspects of the game tie in together with very tight controls and allow you to run through a very well-made platformer with a great learning curve. You'll find yourself breezing through the early levels, getting used to all the mechanics, and then slowly but surely the levels will become more difficult. At first you might think to yourself that the game's actually a little too easy, and anytime you die, there's unlimited lives, so you can just keep trying as much as you'd like. Even the bonus stages let you keep going. But I assure you, the challenge will come and you will die a lot. The deaths in Kaze rarely feel cheap and definitely will make you want to just better yourself at playing. Kaze wears its 16-bit inspiration right on its sleeve. You have the nice bright colors of a Super Nintendo game, along with the fast speed of a Genesis game, or as I like to call it, a Saturn game. The soundtrack to this game is fantastic. Each level has its own unique song, and they're all ones that you would want to listen to even outside of the game. I felt like I was a kid again, locked in my basement, losing hours playing this fantastic game. As the name X-Hardcore will suggest, I do not find myself having the time to make those long play sessions anymore, at least not frequently. So to find a game that made me want to go back to that was quite the honor. And all the hours that I played this game, I was not able to get that 100%, but even though I'm done with the review, it will be a game that I'm going to go back to, and I'm going to shoot to get it.
So that was I Dream of Indie's take on Kaze and the Wild Masks. A fantastic game, and yeah, one that I thoroughly enjoyed. I got the platinum on that one, but let's move on a little, because we've not got much time to get through all of these games. I want to try and keep this video under an hour, which is difficult. So, next one. This is an action platformer, but it's one of the more retro-styled action platformers. One that gets down into the nitty-gritty of old 8-bit style movement, and that is Infernax. And to cover that, we have Noisy Pixel.
While the NES saw the birth of several successful franchises, it also happened to put out a couple sequels seen by many as black sheep titles. Although they're interesting games, the cryptic nature and sometimes questionable game mechanics prevented them from becoming most gamers' favorites in the franchise. Infernax by Berserk Studio and publisher The Arcade Crew embraces the energy and best of these sequelitis titles, but fine-tunes the mechanics, making for an addicting and violent retro experience. Infernax's story begins with the exhausted crusader Alcidor, returning after war only to see his home is in danger. An ancient artifact has unleashed demons and the undead, devastating the land and innocent villagers. It's up to Alcidor to expel the evil creatures as he sees fit and save his home from destruction. The gameplay is highly reminiscent of old-school side-scrolling action-adventure titles. Like those games, it keeps things simple with a standard attack, item, magic, and jump actions as your only means of defense. Later on, you can gain special moves that include an upward thrust, charge, and down strike. These moves also allow you to access new areas in the world, which ties into some Metroidvania elements. One of my first impressions was how Alcidor's jump controlled differently than what I was expecting. Most notable is how you have more control of his mid-air movement than his whip-wielding muse. This strangely took me a while to get used to, but Alcidor controls beautifully and is highly responsive once settled into. Infernax's special and magic moves are all pretty satisfying to pull off. One of my favorite and most frequently used moves was the ability to strike an enemy's projectiles, which sends it flying back at them. Another helpful ability is summoning a familiar, which relentlessly harasses enemies, giving you some much needed breathing room. Until you get these abilities though, Infernax stresses you understand the moves of villains and how vital patience is to dispose of them properly. As challenging as Infernax can be, there is rarely a cheap death to be found, as there are weak spots and tactics to each enemy big and small. If given enough time, you can spot an enemy's patterns and strategically predict their moves. It results in making any death or victory you face more earned. It's another reminder that while Infernax may look retro, each encounter feels thought out and deliberate. Platforming layouts also receive similar treatment. Some sections will stress your execution of abilities to thoroughly understand how they work before you continue. It's an excellent way to teach you to become more accustomed to them. At one point, I felt I would never get the timing of an ability right to advance, but with some trial and error, the mechanic became second nature to me. Infernax's good game design doesn't equate to lack of challenge, however. Most players will die numerous times and in countless ways. Each death sees you dispatched in a variety of vicious animations. In addition, almost all enemies and pitfalls have a unique death animation that is gloriously entertaining to watch. If these mini cutscenes become too much, you can wisely skip through them, as you might see Alcidor die the same way during tricky areas. To help ease your experience, save points restore all your health and mana. The trick is getting to these points before losing all experience and gold gathered. This can be exceptionally daunting during dungeons, which may require you to backtrack to an outside save point when you're worried about losing any meaningful progress. A casual mode can be turned on at any time, which gives you an extra life and allows you to retain some XP and gold acquired. While challenging, Infernax never felt overly difficult for this feature to be turned on, but it's a nice addition to have. The presentation of Infernax is also delightfully gory and over the top. Blood and guts are a constant occurrence, even to the point where it drenches Alcidor after messy encounters. Designs of demons delve into some body and cosmic horror, and while disgusting, it's still really cool. Their designs and attacks are great interpretations of classic demons that manage to also feel unique to Infernax. While the presentation and designs are grotesque, it never feels like it's trying to be overly edgy. Instead, it knows what it is and doesn't take any of its gory fun too seriously.
So, that was Noisy Pixel covering Infernax. Fantastic game, really gets the old style Castlevania, Zelda 2, stylings together and does them so well. One of the better games out there that's trying for that retro aesthetic. But next we're going to get on to this is now my top 5, and these games mean a hell of a lot to me. So At number 5, we have a speedrunner's delight here, and one that brings me back to my childhood, and that is Sonic Mania Plus. And to cover that, we have Billiam.
To say that Sonic Mania emulates the classic gameplay perfectly would be an understatement. This is classic Sonic. This is not an imitation, this is an evolution. Sonic Mania is basically a fan project. It was made by a team who were discovered by Sega after creating Sonic fan games and animations. And because of that, this game knows what made the original Sonic games so great, and it samples from all of them. But of course, there are a few small twists here and there. You can now control Tails' flight when playing as Sonic and Tails, and Sonic now has a drop dash ability which helps maintain his speed when jumping. If you've played any of the classic Sonic games, you already know how Sonic Mania controls. It's smooth, it's quick, and somehow it feels even better than ever before. Like Sonic Generations, Mania features a variety of remixed levels, but this time they're integrated with brand new ones. I was worried that the game would feel stale, but it doesn't whatsoever. The older levels invite you in with familiar music, but then in Act 2, there's a whole new remixed version of the level's theme. Despite the familiar aesthetic, everything feels fresh and new. Green Hill Zone has been recycled so many times that I figured I'd be sick of it by now.
But this ain't your daddy's Green Hill Zone.
It also helps that many of these levels aren't fan favorites that have been played over and over again. Oil Ocean Zone was one of my least favorite levels from Sonic 2. But it's reinvented here to be something new and interesting. Sonic has always had a tight selection of levels, with each and every one having its own unique quirks and identity. New and existing quirks are added to each level to make every act in the game stand out in new and creative ways. And with the return of multiple playable characters, levels are expanded to be larger than ever, with certain areas only accessible to certain characters. There's so much to explore, but you never need to slow down to do it. Older levels also stick out through the new boss battles, which are either a completely new boss or an old boss used in a new way. The boss battles will often use the quirks from the levels or adapt the Rush-style boss to the classic format. There are tons of ideas and visual callbacks to the entire series. I never thought I'd see Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine referenced again, now that Sega is comfortable with Puyo Puyo. Nor did I think that I'd ever see a cameo from Bean, Bark, and Fang the Sniper. One of the things that I really appreciated was the return of the elemental shields from Sonic 3, but now they interact with the environment, it's so cool. The flame shield will sometimes ignite the set pieces like the oil and oil ocean zone, and the electric shield will magnetize you to the top of the level like in flying battery zone. The blue ring item is from Knuckles Chaotix, and the special stages from both Sonic 3 and Sonic CD make a return. But the Sonic CD special stage is updated with 3D graphics. I said in my Sonic Generations video that I believe Sonic Generations had the highest rate of quality levels, but Sonic Mania may have superseded that. It redefines the classic stages in a way that Generations tried to do. But now looking back on it, it wasn't even close to recapturing the feeling of classic Sonic. Mania is a true amalgamation of everything that made classic Sonic great, and somehow, it doesn't just feel like an attempt to recapture Sonic's glory days. This isn't pandering. This is classic Sonic, and you can feel how much love and care was put into it by the development team. This is a product from Sega, but it's a labor of love from the development team.
So that was Billiam covering Sonic Mania Plus, a game that I thoroughly enjoyed, and one that I was actually quite saddened to find didn't have a Platinum Trophy on the PlayStation, because if it did, I would have that Platinum Trophy by now. Sonic Mania Plus, it was everything that Sonic fans wanted out of a Sonic game, so thoroughly enjoyed that. Next, we're going to go over Shovel Knight, and we're going to have Pro Jared go over Shovel Knight for us.
Shovel Knight is a platformer that plays very similar to Mega Man, DuckTales, and Zelda 2. You run, jump, and smack things with a shovel to defeat enemies. You can also use it to downstab and bounce off of enemies, and of course you can use the shovel to dig up treasure or discover secret areas. The jumping is precise, movement is fluid, and any and all mishaps is your fault alone. At no point in my playthrough did I feel like the game cheated me into death. either from weird momentum or questionable landing spots or whatever. It's a mark of an excellent platformer that is very clear on its core gameplay. There are 8 boss knights to defeat, each having their own stage to play through. Each level is wholly unique, with their own themes, enemies, and platforming elements. And it's those elements that make each stage memorable and impressive. Shovel Knight's stage design is akin to what you would see from Capcom or Nintendo during the NES era, if not better. In fact, Shovel Knight does a lot of platforming ideas that I haven't seen done before, partly due to the digging mechanic. The design of the bosses are also worth noting, each having their own fighting style and look. The fights against them are pretty tough. You can definitely die against them, but it's not impossibly hard. The boss fights do not have patterns, which is the strongest asset that they have. They have a set list of attacks, but the order they're used in is not the same every time. How they begin one fight may not be the same as the next. Throw in a few roaming boss battles a la Super Mario Bros. 3, and you've got constant variety as you play through. In every stage, you're collecting up jewels and treasures to add to your gold. This can be used as a means of a high score, but more importantly it's used for upgrades. The world map also has a few towns you can go to. This allows you to talk to a few townspeople and purchase upgrades. You'll be able to increase your maximum health and magic power, and you'll be able to purchase new secondary weapons. You can also get new shovel attacks and different armor. What I like about these upgrades is that instead of doing something simple like deal extra damage or take less, these upgrades change how you play. For example, some of the armors can increase your magic power but make you take double damage. Or my favorite, provide you with a super swing after 2 successful down stabs. This is far more interesting than a simple power adjustment, and it's fantastic. Beating the game unlocks a new game plus mode that allows you to play again with all of your equipment, but you take increased damage. And that alone does make it much more challenging and fun to play again. I can't say enough praises for Shovel Knight. It's some of the best platforming I've ever seen, awesome boss fights, and high replayability. It really lends itself naturally to speedruns. I cannot think of a single thing that Shovel Knight does bad or poorly or wrong.
So that was Shovel Knight, covered by Pro Jared, but Shovel Knight's not my number 4. Shovel Knight is here just for a bit of context, because my number 4 is Shovel Knight Spectre of Torment. And the reason that I'm doing this is I don't consider these to be the same game. Shovel Knight is a fantastic game. It's a huge game, and it had the expansion pack, Plague of Shadows, where you play as Plague Knight. But then it got more and more DLC. But these DLCs, they are so huge. They are completely redesigned, new characters, new levels, new designs behind almost everything. So to call it a DLC feels disingenuous. So for that reason, I consider Spectre of Torment to be a sequel, not a DLC. And yeah, that's what's worthy of my number 4. So to cover Spectre of Torment, we have Expansion Pack with his Neo reviews.
Shovel Knight is a game that you should absolutely play. This is known. I talked about it nearly 3 years ago, and as the years have gone on, that's remained unchanged. Plague of Shadows was the first big update to Shovel Knight, and while it was interesting to play through the game again with both a new character and a new perspective, it was ultimately frustrating to play with Plague Knight, and the best parts of what made Shovel Knight such a hit were lost in the process. It was hard to really complain about Plague of Shadows though, since it was, in and of itself, free DLC. The latest in the trilogy of forthcoming DLC is Spectre of Torment. Unlike Plague of Shadows, which ran alongside it, Spectre of Torment is a tale that happens prior to the events of the original Shovel Knight. Spectre Knight is recruited, so to speak, by the Enchantress. His goal is to round up the Order of No Quarter, with the purpose of gaining power to an amulet that will give him his life back. Without giving too much away, Spectre of Torment tells a much deeper tale than the other 2 installments. Yacht Club Games brings a story that weaves in different characters that were originally bit players and gives them more depth. The story itself is tragic and rather dark. There are lighthearted moments in the tower where you'll do most of your shopping and spend time between levels, but the main narrative doesn't shy away from what's at stake. Similar to the story, the majority of the graphics have been overhauled to a degree for Spectre of Torment. While most of Shovel Knight was bright, vibrant colors, Spectre of Torment favors dark grays and harsh reds to reflect its more serious tone. There's a contrast from the previous ROMs, where Shovel Knight was more adventurous and Plague Knight was more mischievous. Spectre Knight is very sinister. It's reflected well within each level, though plenty remains the same, such as enemies and the knights themselves. Plenty of new characters and returning ones have new animations that are easily the most expressive of the series to date. My personal favorite is Red, the new merchant who trades red skulls for curios. For someone with no face, Red is very good about expressing his disappointment at each skull you bring him that isn't the one he's searching for. And like everything else, the music has also taken a turn. Most of the songs within the game are the same ones we've heard from the original campaign, but with a more menacing edge to them. A change of arrangement here and a different instrument there makes a world of difference, which is no surprise coming from composer Jake Kaufman. There's not a whole lot else to say that we haven't covered already. The sound is just as good as before with a perfect blend of nostalgia while also sounding fresh and new. Plague of Shadows was essentially a new character with minor tweaks to the game to retrofit the campaign to Plague Knight. One would assume Spectre of Torment would follow this formula. It would be wrong. Spectre Knight has a large array of moves to help him traverse the land. He's able to run and jump up walls, chain homing attacks, and has an arsenal of different curios to collect to give him different powers. Spectre Knight is insanely fun to play. Zipping across the screen to chain combos is immensely satisfying, but at the same time, Spectre of Torment does not allow players to abuse the powers they're given. The homing attack will only work when the indicator appears and while Shovel Knight is airborne. On top of that, spamming it is liable to get you killed. The trajectory which Spectre Knight is launched depends entirely on the angle he's attacking from, which leads to some clever secrets and level design. The entire game has been recreated with Spectre Knight's moveset in mind. You'll spend quite a bit of time in the air, homing in on different enemies and wall jumping to climb areas faster. While Plague of Shadows felt like a small character upgrade, Spectre of Torment is essentially an entirely new game. Certain parts of levels are repeated, but they're woven in so well with the new that you'll hardly notice it in the first place. What's clear from the level design alone is how much Yacht Club has learned since the original Shovel Knight. While Plague Knight was frustrating to use, Spectre Knight is easy to pick up and go. The fluid movement and control is there and never feels overwhelming or unfair. Collecting the red skulls to gain curios, like I had mentioned earlier, is rewarding as all hell. Each level has roughly 10 different skulls hidden throughout. Some in plain sight, others require a bit more exploring and trickery to get. You'll then exchange these with red for different upgrades that can be used in exchange for the darkness meter. Now what Spectre of Torment does, and I gotta say this is pretty smart, is require players to perform a small trial that only allows Spectre Knight to use the curios he just purchased. I found myself using these a lot more since I had a good idea as to what they did. Some are situational, others aren't, but requiring players to use these for a brief instant without a huge tutorial being shoved down your throat was oddly invigorating. Similar to Shovel Knight itself, Spectre of Torment doesn't have a whole lot going against it. Yacht Club has given far more than a small character upgrade here. Instead, it's a full-fledged, new story to play through and it's their most engaging yet. Shovel Knight has been well worth the price of entry since its release, and to say that Spectre of Torment is definitely worth the 10 extra bucks is an understatement. Where Plague of Shadows failed, Spectre of Torment absolutely delivers. It's a game that successfully builds upon the original, creating something that's just as good, if not a little bit better in the process.
So that was Shovel Knight and its sequels. A fantastic set of games, and honestly, whilst I consider them to be rightfully sequels, Shovel Knight's Treasure Trove, the pack-in collection where you get all of them, it's basically the equivalent of the Super Mario All-Stars of its day, where you got all the original Mario games, or the Sonic Origins collection that's recently come out, where you got all the classic Sonic games. It is a collector's pack with multiple games in it, and it is well worth getting, because you get not only the original Shovel Knight and the DLC Plague of Shadows, where it is just a reskinned character going through the same levels. You also get Spectre of Torment and King of Cards. 3 fantastic games, well worth your time. But let's move on to my number 3 choice. And this one is a sweaty palm, pixel perfect platformer that made me just adore the action of moving through platformers. And that is Celeste. And covering that we have Snowman Gaming.
Like all great platformers, Celeste isn't complicated. There's only 3 core abilities: jumping, dashing, and climbing walls. That's all you need to conquer the ominous mountain that lies before you. But the way it manages to stay fresh from start to finish is due to the sheer amount of varying gimmicks. Every single chapter has at least 3 new elements that switch up the gameplay, but often even more than that. From fluid space blocks that you can glide through, to grumpy stone face guys that can be moved with a dash, to the free-flowing feather that allows you to move in any direction for a short time. Just when you think you have a particular skill mastered, it'll throw in more curveballs and build on top of the previous mechanics to test you even further. What surprised me, however, was how wonderfully the story fit right into the gameplay. Of course, climbing Celeste Mountain won't be easy, so along the way, your doubts and fears manifest themselves into what I can only describe as your dark side. And this demon-like version of yourself will tease and torment as you try to complete chapters, eventually leading to a full confrontation of an epic boss battle. As you become more adept at tackling the obstacles in your way, the protagonist, Madeline, overcomes her own fears and leads to a phenomenal final chapter where not only do you reach the summit, but learn to believe in yourself and trust that you can defeat anything that stands in your way. It'll still be extremely tough, and believe me, there is a lot more waiting for you when you finish the base experience, but in a lot of ways, we have to vanquish our own doubts in our ability to finish these types of games. Probably the coolest example of this is Madeline thinking about keeping a feather afloat to calm herself down, and then implementing that concept as an actual system later on, a clever way to tell the player to keep their cool as well. While we may not be able to outrun these negative thoughts, we can learn from our mistakes and become a stronger person because of them. It's a powerful message, and done in a tastefully captivating way. But now, after finishing everything this game has to offer, from collecting all the strawberries, to the B-side and even C-side challenges, what I appreciate more than anything else from a game design perspective is how flawlessly Celeste teaches you about its massive arsenal of mechanics. You see, this is the recurring theme I started to notice with Celeste. Each chapter will propose new pieces to the puzzle, but they're taught individually at first, and then built upon as you progress. So eventually, you're flying through insane tests of endurance like it's nothing, because it prepared you for the journey every step of the way. Then, if you're resourceful enough to collect 4 colored hearts by either completing B-side challenges or scouring the areas for cryptic secrets, it unlocks the core, which is my favorite level in the entire game. Yet again, it changes your default capabilities by not recharging a dash when you touch the ground. So now, the only way to get those dashes back is by collecting a replenish diamond. But that's simply the tip of the iceberg, as it hurls you through a cavern of fire and ice, swapping the temperatures with a flick of a switch and changing everything about the rooms constantly. Fireballs that should be avoided become stepping stones of ice. Bouncy platforms that launch you high into the air now are brittle and shatter upon impact. And trackpads that formerly lifted you up slip under your fingertips. It's everything I wanted out of a final stage, and had some incredibly tense moments near the end. But little did I know that there was so much more waiting under the surface. I mentioned B-sides, which can be unlocked by finding cassette tapes in the regular levels, and these show off slick remixes of the music tracks, which are fire by the way, as well as more challenging forms of the stages you've completed. However, unlike most games, Celeste continues to teach you new mechanics and abilities that were previously untouched here, such as being able to jump out of the end of the space blocks to gain more distance, or that you can attain a boost from a beholder by jumping near it when it respawns, or my personal favorite, an upward wall dash that is utterly hard to pull off, but can give you exceptionally more height if you time it right. What's so cool about this is that they've always been available in the game, you just didn't know about them. So now, if you go through the original stages, you have even more mastery over the obstacles, and can find new or faster ways to best them. But indeed, it doesn't end there. After an incredible core B-side level that utilizes all previous mechanics at once, it unlocks C-sides, and while these are the true final challenges, they unbelievably continue to teach new techniques. Most notably, this downward dash boost, that without the knowledge of how to execute would make this area's puzzles seem impossible to complete. What I love about Celeste is all of the hidden capabilities just begging to be discovered. These are remarkably useful for speedrunning, which I have to assume is the final goal the devs want the player to do after finishing all of its trials. But unlike most speedruns, these tools for mobility are not only intentionally left in the game, but explicitly taught to you by the game itself. So why does all of this matter? Certainly Celeste isn't the first game to show new elements and then build on them. In fact, it's very reminiscent of other platforming giants like Super Meat Boy, which also seem to have a never-ending supply of pain. But because of how much Celeste keeps going, long past anyone would expect it to, and reuses old methods in newer ways, it feels like it leaves no stone unturned, and that everything at your disposal had been used to its full potential. I never said to myself, oh man, I wish I saw more of that, or it would have been cool to see this thing combined with that thing, because it actually did all of it. Plus, Celeste gets rewards right, by giving you more game to play when you best the tasks it places in front of you. If the goal from the very start is to conquer our mountains, both physical and mental, the game needs to show you that you're capable of doing it, by encouraging you every step of the way, and making sure you're fully equipped to tackle the road that lies ahead, which is exactly what Celeste achieves so perfectly.
So that was Celeste, possibly one of the finest examples of pure platforming that you can have. So how do we top that at number 3? Well, if you know this channel, you've probably guessed my top 3. But let's not keep people waiting. Number 2, we have Hollow Knight. And to cover that, Ingenious Cloud Gaming.
Usually when you sit down and play a game, you want to get sucked into its world. There are a lot of games out there by now that are great, but it's rare for a game to really nail everything just right. From the music and sound design to the atmospheric level design and all the way down to the movement and combat mechanics, everything about Hollow Knight screams brilliance. Hollow Knight is a 2D action-adventure platformer with a large interconnected world and a focus on exploration and combat, also colloquially known as a Metroidvania. Personally, this is one of my favorite types of games to play because it combines all the best aspects of power progression and world design in a single cohesive experience. But what's so brilliant about Hollow Knight specifically? Well, hopefully by the end of this review you'll know, and if you're as big of a Metroidvania fan as I am, you'll have a new obsession for the next week or so. From the second you begin the game, you're met with an animated cutscene that shows off Hollow Knight's cartoony aesthetic and dark atmosphere. It does a wonderful job of setting the game's mood and lets you know exactly what to expect from Hollow Nest, the game's setting. In a masterful stroke of artistry, the game blends adorable and creepy in the same motion with character and enemy design that is easy to recognize at a glance and can make you go "aww" one moment and then shudder with discomfort in the next. But the best part is that it all perfectly fits in the world that the developers have crafted. The art style is incredibly clean as well, making the whole game feel like it was an animated cartoon rather than a game you're playing, which helps immerse you in the game's world. Hollow Knight's use of color is some of the best I've seen in a long time as well. The beginning of the game is covered in dark and somber looking shades of blue and white that set the scene of a lost and forgotten world. But as you explore further, you're treated with different palettes and splashes of color that evoke the nature and in some cases the danger of any given area. Some of the notable areas near the beginning include the lush vegetation of Green Path and the pink crystalline glow of the Crystal Caverns, and the unique ambience and color palette of each of the game's areas ensure that once you discover and explore any area, you know exactly where you're at and what you're in for. Incredible art can only go so far by itself though. To really balance the audiovisual equation of aesthetic and atmosphere, you really need some stellar music and sound design. Hollow Knight goes above and beyond with the music and the sound. The game's soundtrack ranges from a fast and loud arrangement that will play during a particularly challenging section, to a soft and slow ambient track that fills you with the fear of the dangers that lurk in the darkness. Hollow Knight's soundtrack even includes the lonely and somber track of Dead Silence in some areas, that simultaneously creates a feeling of worry and intrigue as you press further and continue to uncover not only the secrets of Hollow Nest, but your mission in this game's world. But that's not the real strength of this game. The real strength is in its gameplay and its design. Now, I may be a bit biased when I say this since well-crafted Metroidvanias are by far my favorite genre to really sink my teeth into, but Hollow Knight's true strength really lies in its stellar gameplay and map design. I truly believe that what Team Cherry has done with this game's world and the way they handle the optional content is truly a masterstroke of design that is worth studying by any hopeful Metroidvania developers in the future. One of the reasons that this subgenre works so well is the way that it rewards exploration. You go off the beaten path, and you're rewarded with either a new power, more health, more resources, or something otherwise very interesting. At least most of the time. But it's rare for a game to go so far as to make so much completely optional, such that a majority of players will probably never, ever see it. And that's what makes it feel special. It makes you feel like you're truly rewarded for being thorough and invested in a way that most other titles fall short of. The moment-to-moment gameplay is relatively simple, however. You move, you jump, you swing your weapon to attack enemies. As you progress, you'll unlock various permanent upgrades that increase your power, mobility, and health, as you would expect from this kind of title, and many charms, which is a unique feature, with various effects that you can mix and match to your own personal playstyle. The mechanical aspects of the game aren't anything truly innovative or unique, but they're responsive, easy to learn, and most of all, completely fair. It feels good mechanically and doesn't ever get in your way, which allows you to truly get lost in the experience. That doesn't mean, however, that the game is easy. Simple to learn controls allow a great deal of flexibility in the game's combat design, and that's best shown off in the game's various and imaginative boss fights, of which there are very many. And a great deal of those are completely optional as well, and you will die to these bosses. A lot. Hollow Knight takes a lot of cues from the Dark Souls series when it comes to iterative learning through death, while never feeling like it cheated you out of anything. I think that I can say without a doubt that Hollow Knight has secured the spot of my favorite Metroidvania title ever, dethroning even Super Metroid. It's a game that carries one of my highest recommendations ever, so if you're a Metroidvania fan, don't even wait for a sale. Buy this game because it's very much worth your money, and it will be an incredibly memorable experience.
Well, what can I say about Hollow Knight after that? It's just delightful. It's one of those games that I can legitimately devote hours and hours to. I've put over 100 hours into Hollow Knight, and the reason is it is just as good as he said in that video. It is one of my all-time favourite games, not just all-time favourite platformers, and I couldn't be more excited for Silksong if I tried, though tempering that excitement because we all know just how long it's been since it was announced. Sometimes it feels like it may never come out. But what is my number one? What could possibly beat Celeste and Hollow Knight to get to number one? Well, while most of the games on this list can be played on the good old PlayStation 5 and the PlayStation 4 as well, because of backwards compatibility, obviously the PlayStation 5 plays PS4 games. My number one, much like one previous game on this list, requires the old Wii U. And that is Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. To cover that, we have Game Maker's Toolkit.
I totally let Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze pass me by. But please, don't make the same dumb mistake I did, because this game is not only tons of fun, but has some of the most creative and ambitious level design in a platformer, like, ever. And to achieve this, Retro had to really go beyond the level design patterns that had been used in Nintendo's 2D platformer games starting from the NES days and lasting all the way up to games like New Super Mario Bros. U. In that game, almost every level is a showcase for a single idea. Mario has used this design for decades, but so has Donkey Kong. In the Donkey Kong Country games made by Rare, we got levels like Stop and Go Station, where freaky enemies run back and forth until you hit these barrels, and Red Hot Ride, where the Kongs stand on balloons propped up by hot air vents. And this is a good way to design stages, don't get me wrong. I've advocated for similar designs in the past. With this sort of level layout, these games can be filled with loads and loads of unique ideas, and by devoting a single level to them, the idea can be properly introduced and then explored in all sorts of different ways before it's thrown away in favour of something fresh. But it does have some drawbacks. Levels can end up being very short because there's only so many ways to spin each idea. stages can become quite predictable, and you're eventually going to run out of one-shot ideas. So when it came time for Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, this pattern was broken. Look at a stage such as Horn Top Hop. This is a level about horns. You've got horns that blow out enemies, horns that can shoot you into spikes, and giant horns that Donkey Kong can ride on. But it's also a level about falling leaves. You climb up leaves, float down on leaves, there are leaves with enemies on them, and leaves that drift into fiery hazards. And also, it's a level about leaves and horns at the same time. At multiple points in the level, the two mechanics come together, like this section which mixes the falling pattern of the leaves with the quick rhythmic blast of the horns. So where classic Nintendo levels were almost always about exploring a single idea, a typical Tropical Freeze stage might introduce 2 or 3 or even more, and then weave them together at different points in the level. In Baobab Bonanza, we again see 2 different mechanics, but it seems like they're kept separate. We've got some sections with flowers that bend under Donkey Kong's weight, and then some bits where spiked nuts roll down hills. And this would be good enough because each mechanic gives the other time to breathe and stops the level becoming predictable and samey. But then, at the end, the two mechanics combine in a really surprising way, as a giant spiked nut chases you while you jump from flower to flower. Surprise is the name of the game in Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze, and it feels like the level designers are in a constant arms race to outdo one another. And so even in the few levels that stick more closely to the old style of level design, like the kart level Sawmill Thrill, which is largely just about these circular saws, Retro finds so many surprising ways to spin that idea. It's not just about making the saw blades faster or bigger or putting them in larger groups, but the blades carve platforms out of wood, chop up timber hazards, and throw up new bits of track to jump on. Single mechanics are the exception, not the rule though, and Tropical Freeze is stuffed with levels that combine a handful of ideas. And as Turbo Button noted in his video about the level Harvest Hazards, Retro managed to keep these ideas cohesive by finding some kind of thematic link between all of the different ideas on show. More good theming can be found in Fruity Factory. We've got cleavers and conveyor belts that chop up watermelons, drills which mush through grapefruit, blenders that spit out fruity platforms, and swinging arms that smash up watermelons. By thinking less about individual mechanics and thinking more about the theme of a fruit processing plant, Retro could come up with all sorts of wacky ideas. Actually, this whole world is a theme. You see the Snowmads picking fruit in level 1, slicing, crushing, and processing it in the next 3, turning it into jelly in level 5, and freezing it into ice lollies in level 6, which all pays off in the boss fight. From the crazy background art to the bonkers set pieces to David Wise's beautiful and humongous soundtrack, there's an incredible amount of love and attention put into each and every stage in this criminally underplayed game. But the real takeaway has got to be how Retro took the level design pattern that had served Nintendo so well for so long and then evolved it to the next step. By thinking about themes as well as mechanics, Retro managed to forge an incredible set of levels that all modern 2D platformers should be judged against.
So that was Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Yeah, the best platformer I've played. Better level design than anything else, better flow than anything else. The most fun I've had playing a platformer ever. It is a delight and a worthy successor to the Donkey Kong Country series. It really is. So that was my choice, and yeah, this was my top 10 2D platformers. And I want to say all of the clips you've seen. These are just cut down little clips of reviews and video essays from various different YouTubers. Some of them years old, some of which don't make videos anymore. But they are all fantastic channels, so go and check them out. But this is not my last word on the topic, obviously. Each of these games I plan to make my own video on where I discuss the game in depth and give my take on various different things. Just discuss it in a more casual manner. So hopefully this has given you an insight into some of the best platformers out there and into my tastes. And I'll see you in a future video where we will discuss not just these but other platformers in significant depth. Until then, thanks for watching, and I hope this was entertaining. I'll see you next time. Bye.